today is not just another headline in the endless stream of global conflict. No, this is something far more dangerous, far more revealing. The situation has escalated dramatically. The Israel Yemen war is heating up. The Houthis, no longer confined to regional skirmishes, have struck Tel Aviv in response to Israel's attack on Yemen's presidential palace. Now ask yourself, how did we get here? And more importantly, what does this mean not only for the Middle East, but for the global economy, for the balance of power, and for the very future of international politics? The recent strike on Tel Aviv by the Houthis is not just another entry in the long list of Middle Eastern conflicts. It is a development that demands close attention because it signals a dramatic shift in the balance of security perception and strategy across the region. For decades, Tel Aviv has been projected as a fortress city, protected, secure, and symbolic of Israel's resilience in the face of regional hostility. The Houthis piercing that shield is far more than a tactical maneuver. It is a psychological earthquake, one that reverberates through Israel's political establishment, its military command, and its allies abroad. The key question everyone is asking is, how could a militia, long dismissed as underdeveloped and isolated in war-torn Yemen, project its power into the very core of Israel? That is the hook that forces us to rethink not only the military realities but the political illusions that have dominated narratives for too long. Tel Aviv is not just another target, it is the beating heart of Israel's political and economic life. When a missile lands there, it disrupts not only the physical landscape, but the carefully crafted image of invulnerability that Israel has relied upon. For decades, Israeli officials have assured their citizens and the world that their advanced defense systems, most notably the Iron Dome, would shield them from external threats. Yet here we are, watching as missiles evade or overwhelm those defenses, sending shockwaves through a population that has been promised security as a national guarantee. This strike undermines the confidence of the Israeli public, and in turn, it challenges the very legitimacy of a government that built its authority on the foundation of safety and deterrence. That is why this event is not just about damage, it is about credibility. From a geopolitical perspective, the Houthis striking Tel Aviv demonstrates an evolution in asymmetric warfare. Small, decentralized forces have now shown they can bypass the technological superiority of regional superpowers. This is not the traditional David versus Goliath story, because David in this case does not merely resist, he reaches into Goliath's own home. That ability transforms the Houthis from a localized rebel group into a regional force with influence far beyond Yemen's borders. The implications are clear. Every actor in the region, from Iran to Saudi Arabia, from the United States to Russia, now has to recalculate their strategies, knowing that the Houthis have broken through a symbolic red line. The world must pay attention when non-state actors gain the capacity to alter global geopolitics in ways that once only powerful nations could. The economic dimension cannot be overlooked either. Investors and markets pay close attention to strikes like this. Tel Aviv is not only a political hub but also a financial center. The fear generated by such attacks can ripple into stock markets, weaken investor confidence, and raise the cost of doing business in Israel. Add to that the uncertainty around oil and shipping through the Red Sea, where Houthis already holds strategic choke points, and you have the makings of a crisis that touches everyone, from American consumers at the gas pump to European industries dependent on Middle Eastern trade. What begins as a regional war escalates into a global economic tremor, one that ordinary citizens will feel long before policymakers admit its impact. And here is where the real danger lies. Israel is not used to being struck at its core. In Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, conflict has long been framed as happening out there, at the periphery, not in the heart of Tel Aviv. This strike collapses that distinction. The citizens of Israel are no longer watching from a distance. They are now participants, unwilling ones, in a new phase of war where safety can no longer be taken for granted. Governments rise and fall on such shifts in perception, and history tells us that when the public loses faith in its leaders' ability to protect them, political crises follow. What we may be witnessing is not only a military escalation, but the opening act of political instability within Israel itself. For outside powers, especially the United States, this is a nightmare scenario. Washington has built its Middle Eastern strategy on the assumption of Israeli dominance and security. If Tel Aviv is vulnerable, if the Iron Dome is penetrable, if Houthis from war-torn Yemen can shake Israel's sense of control, then the whole edifice of U.S. strategy in the region begins to look fragile. That fragility breeds hesitation, and hesitation invites challenges from rivals, whether that be Iran testing limits, Russia exploiting distractions, or China maneuvering economically while others are consumed by war. What happened in Tel Aviv is not just a local escalation, it is a global signal of changing power. The world must grasp the magnitude of this moment. A missile in Tel Aviv is not simply a missile, it is a declaration that the old order of invincibility is cracking. The question now is whether Israel and its allies will respond with reflection or with more aggression. Because history has shown us again and again, when powerful nations are struck at their heart, they often lash out blindly. And when they do, the cycle of war deepens, economies suffer, and ordinary people, far from Tel Aviv and Sano alike, are left to pay the price. This is the hook, the reality that should capture everyone's attention. Tel Aviv under fire is not the end of a story, it is the opening chapter of a crisis whose consequences will spread far beyond the Middle East. The strike on Yemen's presidential palace by Israel was not a random event, nor was it a simple military maneuver. It was a calculated political act, one designed to humiliate and destabilize. A presidential palace is more than brick and mortar, it is the symbolic seat of sovereignty, a representation of national pride and leadership. By attacking it, Israel sent a message not just to the Houthis, but to the Yemeni people as a whole: your authority is fragile, your leaders cannot protect you, and your sovereignty can be violated at will. But history shows us something important. When powerful nations strike at symbols of identity and governance, they often ignite a reaction far stronger than they expect. That is exactly what happened when the Houthis answered back by striking Tel Aviv. What looked like a show of dominance by Israel instead became the trigger for escalation that may spiral beyond control. Here's the hook: when you strike at leadership, you don't just kill structures or people, you fuel movements, you awaken resistance, and you plant the seeds of retaliation. The Houthis knew they could not leave such an act unanswered. Had they done so, it would have signaled weakness to both their supporters and their enemies. By hitting Tel Aviv, they reversed the narrative. Instead of humiliation, they projected power. Instead of being the wounded party, they became the aggressor capable of inflicting pain on a far stronger opponent. And in doing so, they elevated themselves from a marginalized militia to a force that could no longer be ignored on the regional stage. From a military perspective, striking the palace was meant to disorient Yemeni command structures. Yet paradoxically, it unified them. The Houthis, fragmented at times in their internal politics, suddenly had a rallying point: revenge for the insult to their nation's sovereignty. This is a pattern that empires throughout history have failed to understand. When you attack symbols of governance, you harden the resolve of those you hope to demoralize. The palace strike was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of a larger cycle of retaliation that Israel now finds itself confronting. There is also a psychological layer here. Leaders are not just political figures in the Middle East, they are deeply entwined with identity, culture, and survival. To strike at the palace was to declare that no one is safe, not even the top tiers of Yemeni leadership. But psychology works both ways. For Yemenis who have endured years of famine, bombardment, and poverty, this strike deepened resentment not only toward Israel, but toward the global system that allows such interventions to continue. That resentment becomes fertile ground for recruitment, for resistance, and for the kind of daring retaliation that culminated in Tel Aviv's missile strike. The palace attack, therefore, didn't intimidate, it radicalized. We must also examine the diplomatic fallout. In striking such a symbolic target, Israel didn't just escalate militarily, it cornered itself diplomatically. Regional actors, even those not aligned with the Houthis, Now see Israel as willing to cross red lines that traditionally were avoided. Attacking military bases is one thing, striking a presidential palace is another. It creates the perception of seeking regime change. That alarms not only Yemen but neighboring states who fear they could one day be next. It also complicates Israel's relationships with partners like Saudi Arabia, who have their own delicate balance with Yemen and cannot afford to be dragged into a conflict where legitimacy and sovereignty are under such visible assault. Economically, the palace strike had another effect. It expanded the battlefield. Before this, the Houthis reach into global shipping lanes already posed a challenge to the world's supply chains. But after the palace was hit, their motivation to intensify such disruptions increased dramatically. Insurance premiums for shipping in the Red Sea climbed. Global markets responded nervously. What was framed as a tactical move by Israel suddenly became an economic trigger for instability felt far beyond the borders of Yemen or Israel. This is the hidden cost of symbolic attacks. They reverberate in unpredictable ways. For Israel, the strike seemed like a demonstration of strength, but the reality is far more complex. By targeting Yemen's political heart, they opened themselves to a counterstrike at their own political and economic heart. Tel Aviv is not merely a city, it is Israel's face to the world, and now that face has been scarred. This is the irony of escalation. In seeking to remind an adversary of their weakness, you reveal your own vulnerabilities. The Houthis seized that opportunity, and in doing so, they reshaped the narrative of the conflict. What emerges from this is a sobering lesson. Striking a presidential palace may appear decisive in the short term, but in the long term it often guarantees the opposite. It sets in motion cycles of retaliation that cannot be contained by military superiority alone. It exposes the fragility of power structures built on fear rather than legitimacy, and most of all, it forces the global community to reconsider who holds real influence in the region. The Houthis, through retaliation, proved they were not merely recipients of violence but producers of it, capable of projecting it across borders and into the very core of a nation that once thought itself untouchable. The economic fallout of the Israel-Yemen conflict is perhaps the most underreported yet most consequential dimension of this war. When we hear of missile strikes, palace bombings, and counterattacks on Tel Aviv, our instinct is to view the crisis strictly through the lens of military strategy and political retaliation, but the real battlefield stretches far beyond Yemen's mountains or Israel's cities. It runs through global markets, oil fields, shipping lanes, and the pockets of ordinary citizens around the world. What happened in Tel Aviv and in Sana'a doesn't just stay in the Middle East. It ripples outward, reshaping the cost of fuel, the security of supply chains, and the stability of economies from Washington to Beijing. The hook here is simple. Wars fought with rockets and bombs are ultimately paid for at the gas pump, the grocery store, and in the rising inflation rates that millions of working families face every single day. The Red Sea, one of the most vital maritime arteries in the world, is at the center of this economic storm. Nearly 12% of global trade passes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the choke point where the Houthis have repeatedly demonstrated their ability to disrupt shipping. Now, with the added fuel of Israel's palace strike and the Houthis' retaliatory attack on Tel Aviv, the strategic calculus changes. Shipping companies do not need to be directly attacked to alter course. The mere threat of instability drives up insurance premiums, reroutes vessels around Africa, and adds days or even weeks to delivery times. That translates directly into higher costs for businesses and consumers. The missiles may be falling thousands of miles away, but their economic shockwaves are felt in every household that depends on imports or oil-based energy. Oil prices, already volatile, respond instantly to geopolitical tensions of this magnitude. Yemen sits on the periphery of major oil-producing states, but its strategic geography allows it to hold a knife to the throat of global energy markets. Every time a missile is launched, traders anticipate escalation, futures markets spike, and speculators capitalize on fear. The irony is that while ordinary people brace for higher fuel costs, energy corporations and defense contractors see profits soar. This is the cruel arithmetic of modern war. Destruction in one region translates into windfalls for elites and hardship for the masses. And as always, the narrative fed to the public is one of national security and defense, when in reality, war has become one of the most reliable mechanisms for transferring wealth upward. Israel's economy, too, faces mounting pressure. Tel Aviv is not only a political capital but a financial hub, home to critical tech industries, banks, and global investment. A successful strike there rattles investor confidence and threatens to undermine Israel's reputation as a secure, stable environment for international business. Every investor who hesitates, every company that considers relocation, chips away at the economic resilience Israel has built over decades. In this sense, the Houthis strike was not just a military response, it was economic warfare designed to expose vulnerabilities in Israel's financial backbone. Once again, this is proof that modern wars are not won on battlefields alone, but in boardrooms, trading floors, and energy markets. The global dimension cannot be ignored. Europe, heavily dependent on Middle Eastern energy, feels the shock almost immediately. Rising shipping costs through the Suez Canal, coupled with higher oil prices, push inflation upward, making recovery from past crises even harder. For the United States, where fuel costs remain a politically explosive issue, the fallout of this conflict will show up in consumer prices, voter discontent, and mounting pressure on policymakers. In Asia, where economies like China's and India's rely heavily on imports through the Red Sea, the stakes are equally high. The conflict between Israel and Yemen may seem local, but in economic terms it is globalized conflict, forcing every nation tied to trade networks to share in the consequences. What makes this even more dangerous is the unpredictability of escalation. A single strike that closes a shipping lane for a week could trigger cascading supply chain disruptions worldwide. We saw this during the temporary blockage of the Suez Canal by the Ever Given, which paralyzed trade flows for days and cost billions. Imagine that, but repeated by deliberate military action with no clear timeline for resolution. That is the threat that looms now, a war that weaponizes geography to hold the global economy hostage. Here is the paradox that must be acknowledged. The more Israel strikes at Yemen in an attempt to crush the Houthis, the more incentive the Houthis have to weaponize their control over key maritime routes. The more the conflict escalates, the more the global economy bleeds. And while governments in Washington, Riyadh, or Tel Aviv may frame this as a necessary battle for stability, it is the workers in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas who will ultimately pay for it through rising costs and shrinking wages. That is the real human cost of this war, hidden, quiet, but devastating nonetheless. The palace may have been hit, Tel Aviv may have been shaken, but the far greater blow is being dealt to the arteries of global commerce and the fragile balance of the world economy. Wars today no longer stay confined to battlefields, they bleed into trade routes, they echo in the prices of everyday goods, and they dictate the fates of ordinary people who never voted for them. The Israel-Yemen war has proven that the front lines are as much economic as they are military, and it is in that battlefield that the consequences will be felt most widely. When a missile lands in Tel Aviv, it is not just a military event, it is a psychological rupture that shakes the very foundation of Israel's national identity. For decades, Israel's existence has been built on the promise of security, the idea that no matter how turbulent the Middle East may be, the state of Israel would remain an impenetrable fortress. The government's legitimacy, its credibility, and even its social fabric rest heavily on this unspoken contract that Israeli citizens will be kept safe from external threats. The Houthis strike pierced that promise, and in doing so, they delivered a wound deeper than any physical damage. The hook here is this: wars are not only fought with weapons, they are fought with perceptions, with narratives, with the human need to feel safe in one's own home. And once that sense of safety is broken, repairing it becomes infinitely harder than rebuilding shattered buildings. Tel Aviv is not just another city, it is the beating heart of Israel's cultural, economic, and political life. To see its skies lit with missile fire, or to hear alarms blaring across its neighborhoods, is to confront the unimaginable. the vulnerability of a nation that has projected strength as its defining characteristic. For ordinary citizens, such moments create a lasting imprint. Children huddled in shelters, families rushing to safety, businesses disrupted by fear. These experiences do not fade quickly. They generate a lingering anxiety, a doubt that the government's promises of protection may not hold true after all. And that doubt is as dangerous as any missile because it spreads quietly through the national psyche. For Israel's political leadership, this moment is especially perilous. Their entire narrative, both domestically and internationally, is based on deterrence. Israel is supposed to be the regional power that cannot be touched, the state that others fear to provoke because its retaliation would be swift and devastating. But when the Houthis, a group from one of the poorest and most war-torn countries in the Arab world, can project power into Tel Aviv, the deterrence narrative falters. If Tel Aviv can be hit, then Israel is not untouchable. And if Israel is not untouchable, its enemies gain courage, and its allies begin to doubt the reliability of its power. There is also the matter of image on the global stage. Israel has long cultivated the image of being technologically superior, with defense systems like the Iron Dome presented as virtually foolproof. But when missiles slip through, the spectacle of failure is broadcast worldwide. That image undermines not just Israel's sense of safety, but also its strategic partnerships. Countries that rely on Israeli defense technology, countries that have been persuaded of Israel's dominance, now have to question whether the systems they trust are truly as impenetrable as advertised. This isn't just about military weakness. It's about credibility in the international market of defense and security. The psychological blow is compounded by the symbolic choice of Tel Aviv. This isn't a strike on a remote base or a contested border region. This is the heartland. When core cities are hit, the message is unmistakable. No one is safe, not even at the center of power. That is a terrifying prospect for any nation, but especially for Israel, where the promise of secure living spaces has always been a central justification for state policies and actions. The Houthis knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't just firing a missile, they were firing a message. That message was aimed as much at Israeli morale as it was at physical infrastructure. And here lies the deeper danger. Fear transforms societies. It shifts politics, it drives polarization, it empowers hardliners, and it can erode democratic debate. In Israel, a nation already deeply divided internally, the perception of vulnerability can easily push politics toward extremes. Citizens who feel unsafe demand harsher policies, and leaders who feel cornered double down on aggression. Yet history shows us that fear-driven policies rarely produce security. They often produce more conflict, more violence, more instability. By breaking the illusion of safety, the Houthis may have triggered a chain reaction that alters Israel's political trajectory for years to come. This event also serves as a case study in the limits of military superiority. Israel has cutting-edge defense technology, a highly trained military, and the backing of the world's most powerful allies, and yet all of that could not prevent a strike on Tel Aviv. This paradox, powerful yet vulnerable, is what makes the psychological impact so devastating. It forces citizens and policymakers alike to confront a contradiction they would rather ignore, that absolute security is an illusion, no matter how much money is spent on weapons or how many alliances are formed. The Houthis reminded Israel and the world of that truth in the most dramatic way possible. What makes this situation even more significant is the ripple effect it creates across the region. If the Houthis can hit Tel Aviv, then others, whether Hezbollah, Hamas, or other actors, are emboldened to believe they can do the same. That possibility magnifies the psychological pressure, turning one strike into a specter of many more to come. And in this way, the Houthis' action achieves more than any conventional battle could, that it injects uncertainty into the very core of Israel's sense of safety. And in geopolitics, uncertainty is often more destabilizing than outright defeat. Washington's unshakable support for Israel has long been presented as a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, but the unfolding Israel-Yemen confrontation shows just how fragile and counterproductive that stance has become. For years, American policymakers assumed that the Houthis were an isolated, under-resourced movement with limited influence beyond Yemen's borders. They were often dismissed in Washington as a nuisance rather than a real strategic threat. Yet, with the strike on Tel Aviv, the Houthis have revealed themselves to be more than a marginal force. They are now a regional actor with the ability to disrupt not only Israel's security, but the broader stability of U.S. strategy in the Middle East. And here lies the hook: every time Washington bets blindly on force, dismisses grassroots resistance, or ignores the grievances of poorer nations, it ends up creating the very threats it thought it could suppress. The palace strike by Israel and the subsequent retaliation on Tel Aviv were not just military events, they were demonstrations of how flawed U.S. policy assumptions have become. By standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel while refusing to address the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, the U.S. effectively helped to radicalize and empower the Houthis. A population battered by years of famine, blockades, and airstrikes has nothing left to lose, and groups like the Houthis channel that desperation into resistance. Instead of containing the problem, U.S. policy inflamed it. What Washington thought would remain a localized conflict has now spilled over into the heart of its closest ally, undermining the very security architecture it has spent decades building. This is not the first time such miscalculations have occurred. In Vietnam, U.S. leaders underestimated the Viet Cong until it was too late. In Afghanistan, Washington assumed the Taliban could be crushed by sheer firepower, only to watch them return stronger 2 decades later. In Iraq, U.S. policymakers believed toppling Saddam Hussein would stabilize the region, but instead, it unleashed waves of chaos that continue to destabilize the Middle East today. Now, Yemen follows the same patterns. A so-called weak adversary grows into a formidable force precisely because of foreign intervention and neglect. The Houthis hitting Tel Aviv is not just a tactical success, it is a symbolic reminder of America's repeated failure to learn from history. What makes this even more consequential is how it reshapes the perception of U.S. power in the region. Allies that have relied on Washington's guarantees are now watching closely. If America's strategy leads to Tel Aviv being struck, what does that say about its ability to defend others? If Washington's blanket support for Israel cannot prevent escalation, but instead accelerates it, then confidence in U.S. leadership weakens. Rivals like Iran, Russia, and China are quick to exploit these cracks, presenting themselves as alternative partners for nations frustrated with Washington's heavy-handed policies. In this sense, every missile fired by the Houthis into Israel chips away not just at Israeli security but at American credibility. There is also the economic angle to consider. U.S. defense contractors benefit enormously from crises like these, supplying weapons, technology, and logistical support to Israel. In the short term, war is profitable for the American military-industrial complex, but in the long term, these very conflicts destabilize the global economy in ways that rebound negatively on the United States itself. Higher oil prices, disrupted trade routes, and rising inflation at home all become political liabilities. The American worker ends up paying for the very foreign policy that enriches defense corporations. The hook is sharp here. While elites profit from endless wars, ordinary citizens bear the cost in their daily lives, both abroad and at home. Domestically, this backfiring policy poses risks as well. American voters are increasingly skeptical of unending foreign entanglements. When they see billions of dollars flowing to Israel, even as their own infrastructure decays and healthcare costs skyrocket, the contradiction becomes harder to justify. A strike on Tel Aviv by the Houthis may seem distant, but when it raises oil prices in Los Angeles or New York, the conflict suddenly feels much closer to home. Washington's insistence on blindly backing Israel risks creating political backlash within its own borders, as citizens grow wary of footing the bill for wars that generate instability instead of security. At its core, the Houthis' ability to strike Tel Aviv is a direct indictment of U.S. foreign policy arrogance. For too long, Washington has believed that military superiority and financial leverage were enough to shape outcomes in the Middle East. But power without understanding, weapons without diplomacy, and alliances without accountability do not produce stability, they produce resistance. The Houthis, once viewed as little more than a militia clinging to survival, have become proof that marginalized groups can rewrite geopolitical narratives when pushed far enough. The uncomfortable truth for Washington is that this strike is not just Israel's problem, it is America's failure. It exposes the hollowness of a policy that prioritizes short-term military support over long-term political solutions. It reminds the world that U.S. power, no matter how vast, cannot indefinitely suppress the aspirations of people fighting for recognition and survival. And it leaves Washington facing a dilemma: double down on the same failing strategies, or finally acknowledge that true stability requires dialogue, compromise, and a willingness to confront the root causes of conflict rather than merely its symptoms. When we talk about the so-called global order, what we are really referring to is a system of power, an architecture built after World War II that was designed to concentrate decision making in the hands of a few dominant nations while presenting the illusion of fairness and balance. The conflict between Israel and Yemen, and the fact that Houthis are now striking Tel Aviv itself, is not an isolated flare-up. It is a signal that the framework of this old order is breaking apart, and it is doing so in ways that even the architects of that order never anticipated. Here we see, in dramatic fashion, how military dominance and alliances once thought unshakable are proving incapable of containing the ambitions and resolve of actors who were once dismissed as peripheral. The Houthis were never supposed to be in this position, yet here they are, forcing Israel, Washington, and the wider West to confront the limits of their power. That is not just a military reality, it is a political earthquake. What makes this even more profound is that it is not happening in isolation. All across the globe, we see fractures emerging in the once dominant structures of authority. Russia and China openly challenge U.S. hegemony, regional alliances realign in the Middle East, Africa pushes back against centuries of exploitation, and Latin America experiments with new forms of independence. The Houthis striking Tel Aviv is one chapter in a larger book being written about a shifting balance of power. Every missile that lands on Israeli soil is not just a tactical victory for a militia, it is a symbolic statement that the old rules, the rules written by empires, are no longer universally accepted. That symbolism is powerful, and it reverberates far beyond the battlefield. It invites other marginalized actors to test boundaries, to push back, to demand recognition. The global order is crumbling not just because it cannot suppress resistance, but because it has lost legitimacy in the eyes of so many. Think about the irony here. For decades, the United States and its allies believed that overwhelming military superiority guaranteed stability. Aircraft carriers, nuclear weapons, intelligence networks, all designed to project unchallenged dominance. Yet in Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the Arab world, a movement that grew out of resistance and desperation has pierced through the armor of that system. This is not simply a tactical failure, it is a philosophical one. The very idea that power can be enforced indefinitely through force is being exposed as flawed. And when philosophy collapses, when belief in the inevitability of empire collapses, that is when change accelerates. The Houthis strike on Tel Aviv embodies that collapse. It says no empire, no matter how advanced, can guarantee security against people who refuse to submit. That message resonates not just in the Middle East, but in every region where resistance simmers. Here's the hook that should concern policymakers. Once the illusion of absolute security shatters, it cannot be restored. Israel was built on the promise of being a safe haven, an impregnable fortress for its people. The United States projects itself as the ultimate guarantor of that security. But when Tel Aviv is hit, when ordinary Israelis see that the fortress can be breached, the political and social consequences are enormous. Fear grows, trust erodes, questions multiply, and those questions don't stop at Israel's borders. They reach Washington, London, Brussels. If a movement like the Houthis can challenge the system so effectively, what does that say about the sustainability of the global order built on power projection? What does it say to others who may be calculating their own resistance? The cracks widen, and every new blow deepens them. And let's not forget the economics of all this: global trade, finance, investment. All of these depend on a predictable order. Investors need to believe the rules are stable, that the powerful are in control. When events like this occur, when missiles fly into Tel Aviv from Yemen, investors don't just see a regional conflict, they see instability creeping into the very core of the system. Insurance premiums rise, shipping routes are disrupted, commodity markets fluctuate wildly. The economic ripple effect is inseparable from the political one. The crumbling of order is not just seen in military vulnerabilities, it is felt in stock markets, oil prices, and consumer costs around the world. That is why this is bigger than Israel, bigger than Yemen. It's a story about the fragility of a system we were told was unbreakable. The truth is, what we are witnessing is a historic shift. The global order is not being toppled by rival empires in grand battles as history books once described. Instead, it is being chipped away by smaller players who refuse to play their assigned roles. Yemen's Houthis, striking the heart of Israel, embody that resistance. It's not about their size, it's about their determination, their willingness to defy, their ability to adapt. And that lesson, that empires can be defied, that power can be resisted, will spread. It is already spreading. The crumbling global order will not be rebuilt the way it once was. Something new is emerging, and the only real question is whether the current powers will recognize this reality and adapt, or whether they will double down on a failing strategy of force only to accelerate their own decline. And so, I close with this. The Israel-Yemen war is not a distant, isolated struggle. It is part of the unraveling of an old order, one in which the powerful impose and the weak suffer. That order is crumbling, strike by strike, missile by missile, and palace by palace. What comes next depends on whether leaders in Israel